Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. I know we're in time zones spanning the globe, and I appreciate everyone who's tuning in late at night or early in the morning. Thanks for joining us. Um, for the next, I guess, hour and a half or 2 hours, we're going to be talking about writing for a research audience. And I'm going to offer some of my perspectives on this, what I've sort of labeled as tips for greater success. Just a couple of truth in advertising statements before we get started. Um, First of all, I would want to point out that everything that I'm going to say is based on my experience and my views. I have now been an academic for about 30 years, spent much of that time as an assistant and associate professor, uh, as a graduate student. Um, I spent many years as the editor of a journal, and I've spent a long time uh, participating in review processes at journals, um, as an author, as a reviewer, and as an editor. So all of the views that I'm going to share with you are somewhat informed by my experience, but I would underscore that there are other views, and if you talk to other people with other experiences, you're going to get different perspectives. And so please keep that in mind. I'm an economist by training, and most of the scholarly work that I've done has been oriented to an academic economics audience. But there are certainly different kinds of academic circles, and the norms and practices within those circles differ somewhat. And so you need to talk to others in your network and get their experiences and perspectives as well. The other thing that I would like to say is that many, many, many good papers get rejected from journals. Um, what I'm going to share with you is no surefire method to get your paper accepted. The process of getting a paper accepted at a journal is the result of many, many small cumulative things, some of which are under your control and some of which are not under your control. And one of the things that I want to share with you today is some of the things that are under your control. And finally, I would want to underscore that no matter um, how good a job you do writing your research paper, a good written paper is no substitute for good research. And so everything that I'm going to be talking about begins from the perspective that you have a good research story that you're trying to tell. Okay, so if you're deciding whether you want to spend the next 2 hours listening to me, I'll just say that you're welcome to, but the lab is going to benefit the most those who are currently working on papers that are nearly ready for submission to a journal. If you have a paper that isn't ready to submit to a journal, you'll still, I think, get some information that's useful and helpful as you begin to package your work for submission to a journal. I'm going to share approximately 50 slides with you. We're going to have 4 breaks, and during each of those breaks, there'll be exercises for you to work on. I've distributed worksheets, and I believe a link to those worksheets has been placed in the chat. Those worksheets can be completed now during the breaks. They can be completed later after the learning lab is finished. You may choose never to complete the worksheets. That's okay. They're just for your help in thinking through some of the issues that we're going to be discussing. And although I'm quite open to questions, there is a very large number of participants on the call. There are upwards of, I think, 70 participants at this count. So please save your questions for the breaks, and I'll try to answer them during the break time. Okay, so here's a quick outline of what I'm going to cover. And some of these topics may be surprising to you, but as we go along, I'll describe and discuss why they're in the outline. First, I want to talk about responsible conduct of research, because I think that underpinning all of our work and all of our goals in terms of getting our papers and our research published, we have to have a very strong foundation of conducting our research responsibly. And if we do that, I believe that it will be evident in the work that we publish. And if we aren't conducting ourselves in a responsible way or in an ethical way, that too will be visible in the work that we submit to journals. And so it's important to begin from a very strong foundation of conducting your research in an ethical and responsible way. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the academic publishing process, again, from my perspective, and from the experience that I've had. I think that it's helpful when you're trying to get your papers published to understand how journals work, what's happening behind the scenes, and that can help you a little bit in strategizing about how to publish your own papers. Then the third topic that I want to discuss is basic strategies for writing. Maybe that's the thing that most attracts you to the Learning Lab. And so we'll spend some time talking about strategies for writing that can strengthen your submission to a journal. And then I'll talk a little bit specifically about titles, abstracts, introductions, and conclusions. So that's the basic outline, and we'll have some stops along the way. So beginning with responsible conduct of research. The reason why I think responsible conduct of research or ethical conduct is important when we're writing papers and when we're doing research is because if your work demonstrates that you're conducting yourself in an ethical way, it will be evident to those who read your papers, and it will be evident to the editors and the reviewers who are looking at your work, and it will increase your chances of success. The opposite is also true. If you're conducting yourself in an unethical way or conducting your research in a way that doesn't adhere to the highest ethical standards, chances are you won't be able to hide that fact from the people who are reading your work and reviewing your work. And so it's important to begin with responsible conduct of research as a foundation. So what do I mean by responsible conduct of research? Typically, it refers to the ethical conduct of the researcher, and in the case of multiple authored papers, the ethical conduct of all of the researchers and perhaps the group as a research team. It begins with the ways in which data are collected, including the oversight and approval of institutional review boards who will be reviewing and approving data collection methods, including survey methods, and the ways in which experimental subjects or respondents to surveys have been recruited and used in the research. I want to highlight that this seminar is in no way a substitute for a seminar on IRB or responsible recruiting of experimental subjects. That's something that I hope all of you have access to. It's an important part of the research process, but I can't spend a lot of time today talking about IRB. In addition to how the data are collected, responsible conduct responsible conduct of research refers to how your data are managed, how the data are analyzed, whether the ideas that you're presenting are original, or if not original, how you're attributing those ideas to others. And so among the things that you have to be thoughtful about is documenting your sources, citing and borrowing material with appropriate credit, acknowledging the contributions of non-authors to your work, and resolving issues related to authorship. And importantly, I think it's very important for everyone to think about issues related to authorship before a paper is submitted to a journal. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So when it comes to documenting sources, one of the things that I want to emphasize, and some of you may be early in your careers, some of you may have been conducting research for a long time and submitting articles for many years. But for those who are just starting out, I think it's often a little bit challenging to accept that all of the work that we do and all of the activity that sort of falls under the heading of normal science is incremental in nature. In other words, all of the work that we do builds on the work of others. We test theories, we revise those theories, we test them again, we publish results, and then we react to those published results by developing new theories and approaches and testing those. Oftentimes, when we're starting out in our careers, we can often feel a little bit of insecurity about our own ideas. And I think it's very important to understand that there's nothing wrong with admitting that your work builds on the work of others. And in fact, in the scientific community, that's what we expect. We expect that you're going to be relying on other people's work. And in general, in the publishing process, we expect papers to build on the work of others, and we reward people for acknowledging that their work builds on the work of others, right? So the ethical approach to conducting research is to document the work of others through literature reviews, to correctly attribute the thoughts and ideas that are in your paper to the work that others have done, and then to demonstrate and explain to your readers how you are extending and expanding that work, or perhaps filling gaps that exist in the existing literature. So when you're signaling to your academic community, to editors and to reviewers, that you're building on the work of others, you're really fitting into a normal pattern that people expect. It becomes very clear when you're misrepresenting previous findings or the work of other people. And that unethical behavior is, I think, often very obvious, especially if the people who are reviewing your work are familiar with the literature that you're trying to contribute to. Oftentimes, the people who are reviewing your work are people who know the literature as well as you do, if not better, and they'll very clearly see where the thoughts and ideas and work of others has been misappropriated or misrepresented. So the goal here is to use and build on the work of others. In doing that, we want to acknowledge and document sources. We want to clearly indicate where ideas come from. We don't want to use the exact language of other people unless we're putting those words in quotation marks. So in other words, we want to avoid plagiarism, but at the same time, we want to use the ideas and the results that people have produced in the past, acknowledging and synthesizing those and presenting them in our own words, but with proper citation and attribution. So I'll just say one or two words about plagiarism. Typically, we think of plagiarism as using the words or ideas of others without providing credit. So in other words, if I take the exact words that someone else has written and I put those into my paper and I don't put them in quotation marks, or I don't attribute them to someone else, then I'm committing plagiarism. It's theft and it's not permissible. Typically, we might think of plagiarism simply as using someone else's words, but it's not limited to using exact words. It could include using the ideas that other people have presented and presenting them as our own. So we have to be careful when we're borrowing the work of others and representing it clearly. And not only is that the right thing to do and the ethical thing to do, but it's also a strategically important thing to do when you're trying to get your papers published. All right, so I want to transition now to talking about authorship, because in my experience as an editor, as my experience as an author and as a member of research teams, I've come to understand that making decisions over authorship on a paper can be quite complicated. So one of the first questions that needs to be asked is, who exactly is entitled to be an author on a paper? The slide here includes a link to the International Conference for Medical Journal Editors, that have some guidelines for co-authorship. And their guidelines state that a co-author or a person should be included as a co-author on a paper only if that individual has made substantial contributions, has helped to draft the article or revise it, and only if that individual has had a chance to make final approval of the version that's going to be published. So in other words, in order to be considered as a co-author, someone can't have just arm's length relations to the research. They really need to be a part of the research team, involved in the conception, the design, the analysis, the interpretation of the data, and to be very familiar with the paper that's going to be published. One of the rules of thumb that I've always tried to use with my own students and with colleagues is that a person who's going to be co-author on a paper should be able to go to a conference and present the findings that are contained in the paper. If the person doesn't know the paper well enough to stand up in front of an audience and describe what's in the paper, then that person probably shouldn't be a co-author. And importantly, every person listed as an author should have an opportunity to read and approve of the final version of the paper. Again, this is ethically important, but it's also strategically important if you're trying to get your papers published. The issue of who's going to be the primary author is often another sticking point. Typically, the person who has the original idea or has provided the major intellectual input, or the person who did the most work on the paper. It shouldn't be based on seniority, and it shouldn't be based on administrative position. It should really be based on who came up with the idea, who provided most of the input to the paper, who contributed the most work. And it should be the consensus of all co-authors. There shouldn't be disagreement about this. And again, although this is ethically important, it's also strategically important when you're trying to get your papers published, because it can sometimes be the case that if there's not consensus of the co-authors about who should be authors and who should be the primary author on the paper. It can often cause problems at the publication stage that cause your paper to be rejected by a journal. And I would also point out that some journals now, not all, but many, require at the time of submission all of the co-authors on the paper to sign off on the co-authorship of the paper that's being submitted. Okay, so final slide on authorship. The recommendations here are, I think, generally useful. First and foremost, I would encourage everyone to discuss authorship at the beginning of the process, not once the paper is accepted for publication. And I've indicated here that you are the one who should bring it up. I say you because no matter who you are in the list of authors, if no one else is bringing up the topic, then you should bring up the topic. It should be discussed. You should never add a colleague's name simply as a quid pro quo. In other words, if someone says, well, if you add me as an author on your paper, I'll add you as an author on my paper. There shouldn't be any judgment about who belongs on a paper other than who contributed to that paper. Similarly, you shouldn't simply ask someone to make a minor or trivial contribution to the paper just as a precondition for becoming a co-author. The people who are involved in the research should really have a deep investment in that work. Similarly, and this is probably one that's the most difficult to handle in practice, is that a senior faculty member doesn't become a co-author simply because they supervised the work or secured the funding. In other words, if you're including a senior faculty member, a supervisor, someone who supported financially the work as a co-author, it should be the case that that individual also provided intellectual content to the work and participated in the crafting of the paper. It doesn't mean that a co-author has to be responsible for everything. A co-author may only be responsible for some portion of the paper, but the contribution should be clear. And finally, I would say that in these days of electronic communication, if you have a disagreement, try to discuss it in person or by phone, not simply by email or by text message, because those forms of communication can't communicate the kind of nonverbal cues that are important in these kinds of sensitive matters. Okay, so I've been talking for a while and I'd like to pause. And the question that I want to know is whether everyone has access to the authorship worksheet that I provided. Alex, how successful were we in sharing the worksheet?
Yeah, so it should be in the chat for you folks. If anyone's having any trouble opening that, let me know, and I can provide a link to a Google Drive document that might be easier to access.
Let's see. I'm also going to put it on screen, if that's okay.
Mhm.
Let's see if this works. All right, so it's just a one-page worksheet. Can everyone see that? And as I said before, you can work on this now for the next few minutes, or you can put it aside and work on it later. But I think depending on what kind of research team you're working in and what kinds of authorship issues may apply, it can be helpful to think through the questions that I've outlined here. So first, how common is it to have multiple authorship in your subdiscipline? Um, what kinds of criteria are used in your subdiscipline to determine who's included in the list of co-authors? How is the order of authorship determined? And then if you're working on a particular paper right now, then I think, questions 5, 6, and 7 are really essential for you to work on. First, does your paper have multiple authors? If so, who are they? What have they contributed? Have you discussed authorship with your co-authors? If so, what kinds of agreements have you reached? And if you haven't discussed it, then what do you need to do before you submit your paper to clarify those authorship issues? Again, I think that most of the problems that I've seen and that I've encountered in my career have been as a result of questions 6 and 7 not being discussed openly. They're very, very awkward conversations in some cases, but I can assure you that the conversations are less awkward at the start of the process than they are at the end. So I'm just going to pause here for a couple of minutes and give you a chance to either jot these ideas down on a worksheet if you have them, if you have the worksheet at hand, or if you don't, just kind of reflect on it a little bit on a pad of paper and think about how authorship applies in the case of a paper that you're working on currently. And maybe if there are some of my more senior colleagues online, you might want to share your experience. If there are some who have had awkward or difficult situations, maybe you could share that experience and tell us how you resolved it. Anybody willing to unmute your microphone?
Um, I'm talking from Nigeria. From my experience in Nigeria here, even at my master's level and my PhD level, despite I'm the sole researcher, carrying out the research, doing all the rigorous things, and one of the things that supervisors always put into consideration is that when you enter, you want to publish, they have to be the first author. And that has been the mentality of majority of us in the university and other institution, higher institution, that your supervisor, because he is your supervisor, he has to be the first author. Though it affects you mentally and emotionally that you are putting everything into this research, he is just a guide. But at the end of the day, they will just be the first author. And especially if you have a co-supervisor, the co-supervisor will be the second author, while the original owner of the research will be the third author. And from observation and what was being heard is that, in most of the Nigeria universities and other institutions here, majority of these supervisors or these senior colleagues use that as a form of promotion, that there's a grade for being a first author, second author, or third author. It's like 5 point, 3 point, 2 points, like that. So when they have like 5 publications, being a first author in all the papers, when they want to do their promotion, it gives them a higher grade that will make them qualify for that, for the next position they are going in their academia cadre. So that has been most of the, it's like it has become a culture in Nigeria. I don't know if that is changing, but that's my own experience. I remember in my master's level, we published 3 publications from my master's work, and my supervisor is the first author in all the publications. So that is it. But when it comes to your colleague level, now that you are not a lecturer, we reach agreement together. Let's assume we are having 3 different researches to be carried out that are multidisciplinary. So what we do is that we interchange. If I'm a first author, in this, but everybody must contribute. We give ourselves roles to play. Some are very good in analyzing, some are very good in coming up with the statement of the problem, the objectives and things like that. From there, we work together in unity to, okay, be the first author in this, I'll be the second author, you'll be the first author in this, I'll be the second author. But to the senior, to the supervisor and things like that, you can't say that to them because they see that as an authority for them to be a first author. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. I realize that it can be very frustrating, and that at the same time, what are considered norms differ from place to place, and what is expected can be quite different from country to country or institution to institution. I think that, you know, there's still, I think, value in having conversations surrounding authorship. And if someone is insisting on being an author on the paper, it's important to make sure that that individual is contributing, maybe reading the paper, maybe making editorial suggestions, and is familiar with the research. The only thing that I can say regarding sort of changing the culture in an institution is that it can be a long-term process. But I hope that, you know, for many of you who are starting out in your careers, as you become senior in your field and as you become supervisors rather than students, that you'll adopt some of the practices that you feel are most appropriate. So I think, you know, as the old saying goes, you need to be the change that you want to see in the world. And so if you think that the system isn't working properly, then you have an obligation to try to change it. But I understand that cultural norms differ in scientific settings in different places, and that these conversations and situations can be quite awkward. Okay, I want to keep moving because I don't want to spend all of our time talking about authorship. As we move on from authorship, I'd just like to remind everybody that not everybody has to be an author on a paper. And sometimes the appropriate way to indicate who's contributed to a piece of work is through acknowledgements. Acknowledgements often appear on the title page of an article. Sometimes they appear at the end of the paper. And they may be individuals who helped you, but are not necessarily authors on the paper. So someone who maybe read it and gave you editorial suggestions, or someone that you discussed ideas with early in the process. It could include acknowledging institutions or projects that supported your work, either financially or in other ways. And it may also acknowledge any specific details regarding where the data came from. If you're using data that were collected by someone else, then you may want to acknowledge the source of the data. So sometimes if you have concerns and you think that someone doesn't necessarily belong as an author of a paper, maybe the correct approach is to acknowledge that person's contributions in a footnote to the paper. Okay, so now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the academic publishing process, because I think understanding it can be helpful. I think that there's a certain mystery that surrounds it, and I'd like to dispel some of that mystery. The first thing that I want to kind of underscore is something that didn't really exist when I started my career, but is now becoming an increasing problem in our disciplines. And that is the existence of predatory journals that often invite you to submit an article. Often, if they invite you to submit an article to publish in their journal, they expect you to pay to publish, often upfront, sometimes substantial amounts. And I would just say that if your goal is to establish your academic career or your reputation as a researcher, that you should avoid those predatory journals as much as possible. There are lists of predatory journals if you're not sure whether the journal that's in question is a predatory journal. The preferred journals are typically not going to invite you to submit an article, and they're typically not going to ask you to pay simply as a guarantee of publication at the start of the process. There may be journals that have page charges, but those page charges would often be levied at the end of the process after a paper is accepted and after it's been reviewed. So if a journal's contacting you directly and saying, please submit your article to our journal, and then asking you to pay for that privilege up front, it's probably not a journal that you want to be publishing in. The preferred journals are owned by the academic community. Either literally they're owned by the scientific community, or they're published by a publishing house on behalf of an academic community. Typically, those journals are governed by page budgets, although page budgets are becoming less important as journals move more and more of their publication online. But typically, an academic journal will have an acceptance rate ranging from 10 to maybe 40 or 50%. So the implication of that is that rejection is the rule, not the exception. So when you're submitting to reputable journals, you should expect that your paper will probably not be accepted. If it is accepted, it probably won't be accepted in the form that it was submitted. It will be revised multiple times, and there'll be no guarantee of acceptance during the revision process. It means that your paper will typically spend a lot of time in the hands of other individuals. And so you want to spend time making your paper as strong as possible before it's sent to reviewers, because the time that it spends with reviewers will be significant, and you won't be making any contributions to the paper during that process. And you want to make sure that it gets through the review process in a favorable way. So just to give you a sense of how long review takes, I have two charts of data. One is from a colleague in Australia, David Pinnell, who actually kept track of the time between submission and decision for a number of articles. So in this chart, each bar represents a paper, and they're just in chronological order of papers that he submitted to journals. And you can see that the time from submission to final decision ranged from 100 days at the shortest to 900 days at the longest. So just under 3 months in one case, and nearly 3 years in another case. So that's just one set of data. I spent 10 years as the editor of the journal Agricultural Economics, and here's a chart of data from the time that I served as editor. It includes about 2,000 articles that were submitted to the journal. The green bar, the green line shows papers that were accepted, the red bar, papers that were rejected, and the dotted line is those that were invited to revise and resubmit. And you can see that the typical data kind of line up with what was shown in the previous chart. Most papers submitted, reviewed, and accepted in roughly 100 days or so, but some with a much longer tail, some with more than a year or 2 years in the review process. So keep this in mind as you're submitting your own work. And again, the importance of this is that there's a very long period of time in which your paper will not be in your hands, but it will be in the hands of reviewers. And so it makes sense for you to invest as much as you can in making your paper strong before it gets into the hands of reviewers. The way that journals operate is that there's usually an association or a university or a publishing house that owns the journal. The journal has a policy board, usually senior academics who have experience in the discipline. Most journals have one or more editors who are sort of the gatekeepers for the journal. Those editors sometimes have editorial assistants who help them, sometimes not. There's typically a set of associate editors who sometimes serve as super reviewers for the editors. And then reviewers. And reviewers are typically just researchers like yourself who are asked to judge the quality and content of the papers that are submitted to the journal and to make a recommendation to the editor about whether the paper is suitable for publication. One thing that I'd like to underscore is that reviewers don't work for authors, and reviewers are not obligated to provide suggestions or advice or ideas for revising papers. Reviewers really have a responsibility to tell editors whether a paper is suitable for publication or not. It's often customary for reviewers to provide feedback to authors and suggestions for how they can make their papers better, but they're not obligated to do that. Editors are only asking reviewers to make a judgment about whether a paper is acceptable for publication. So as a reminder, when you send your paper to the journal, you're not sending your paper in the hopes of getting suggestions from a reviewer about how you can make the paper better. You're sending your paper because you want it to be published and you want the editor to judge the paper worthy of publication. And the way that the editor will do that is by seeking the opinions of reviewers. So editors rarely have an agenda. They're trying to serve the academic community. They want to publish the best possible papers, subject to all the constraints that they face. They're typically very busy people. They are teaching, they're conducting their own research, they're supervising students, they're working as administrators, they're writing grant proposals, they're trying to publish their own papers. Editing is typically just an extra responsibility that is on top of all the other things that they're doing. And it's useful to keep that in mind because you don't want to bother editors and you certainly don't want to give them extra work to do in judging papers that are not worthy of publication. The editor's responsibility is to fill the journal with papers that are going to be read and cited. So when an editor encounters a paper, when your paper is sent to the journal, the editor is thinking about the paper from the perspective of, will this paper be widely read? Does this paper provide novel methods? Does it have an interesting story? Is it going to be appealing to a general set of readers? And because that's the way that the editor is viewing the paper, it's important that your paper signals to the editor that it's interesting, that it may have general appeal, it may have novel methods, and that it may be widely read and highly cited. One of the things that you want to be careful about is presenting to the editor a paper that contains obvious mistakes or problems, because editors are much more interested in rejecting a good paper than accepting a bad paper. And because of limited time and because of the bias towards rejecting papers, they're often going to err on the side of issuing a reject decision to quickly move on to other papers in the queue. So it's extremely important that the quality of your paper as presented to the editor is high enough that the editor will want to send it to reviewers. Many papers get rejected before they ever make it to the reviewer stage. So the editor will desk reject a paper. So desk reject simply means that you submit the paper, the editor looks at the paper, and the editor rejects the paper without sending it out for review. It could be that at some journals, as much as 20 or 30 or 40% of papers that are submitted get desk rejected without review. So what would cause a paper to get a desk reject? Well, if the paper doesn't present an interesting story, if the analysis is weak or the writing is obviously weak, it might get rejected. If it's a very, very narrow subject that doesn't have findings that are generalizable, or if you haven't made a case in the paper that the findings will be of wider appeal, then it could get rejected. Papers that are submitted to a journal that are not a good fit for that journal will be rejected. And papers that are very close to review may. Somebody needs to mute the microphone. Okay. All right. So if the editor looks at your paper and decides to send it to review, he'll try to match, or she'll try to match, the subject matter of your paper and the methods used in your paper to reviewers. So typically an editor will pick 2 or maybe 3 reviewers. In rare cases, perhaps just 1. But reviewers will always be chosen on the basis of knowing something about the topic. When I was an editor, I often tried to pick 1 reviewer who understood the subject matter of the paper and 1 reviewer who probably understood the methods being used in the paper, so that I would get a good reading on both of those aspects. Typically, editors don't overrule reviewers. So if a reviewer says they think that the paper should be rejected, then the editor will probably reject the paper. So as an author, if you're thinking about trying to get your paper past the editor and to the reviewer, your strategy has to involve the following. First, you need to avoid very small and very obvious mistakes. The most common mistakes in writing are signals that could be taken as predictive of mistakes in the analysis. So for example, and I'll say this again, if a title has mistakes in it, or an abstract has mistakes in it, typographical mistakes, grammatical mistakes, it may be that whoever reads the abstract will say to themselves, well, if the author can't correct the mistakes that are in the abstract, how can I be sure that the analysis was done correctly? So even if English is not your first language, or sometimes even if it is, you should get help with the written English, and especially make sure that your title and your abstract are free from mistakes. The second strategy is to make sure that the subject matter of your paper is aligned with the journal. So The way that I like to think about a journal is as a place where a conversation about research is taking place. It's taking place over a long period of time through a series of articles. But one of the surest ways to get an editor interested in your paper is to demonstrate that it connects to a conversation that's been taking place in that journal. And so as you submit your work, you might include a short cover letter that indicates that the paper is connected to a conversation that's been taking place in that journal, or to papers that have previously appeared in the journal on similar topics. If you get past the editor to the reviewer, then your goal is to win over the reviewers and get an invitation to revise and resubmit. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about developing a hook for your paper, making sure that you have a good story. But most of the time, the goal for getting the reviewer interested in your paper is clearly identifying what your contribution to the literature is, being clear about the research question, and being clear about your methods. If I look at all of the reviewer reports that I received over 10 years as an editor, I would say 50% of the negative reviews focused on the lack of a clear research question. So many times I received a referee report that said, I read this paper, but I couldn't understand what the research question was. The author never was clear about what research question they were trying to answer or what hypothesis they were trying to test. The other 50% of negative reviews were ones in which reviewers would say, well, I understood what the research question was, and I kind of understand what they learned, but I'm not quite sure how they did the work. The methods are not clear. So when you're communicating in your paper to readers, you want to be extremely clear about what the research question is and extremely clear about your methods. It's typically the case that if you have a good story, that reviewers will be with you and interested in seeing your paper developed into a publication. It's very rare for a reviewer to say, I understood the research question, I understood the methods, but I disagree with the conclusions, and because I disagree with the conclusions, I think the paper should be rejected. Negative reviews rarely focus on the conclusions of a paper, mostly on the way that the story is told. Because admittedly, any researcher working with the same hypothesis and the same data using the same methods should reach the same conclusions, right? And so if the hypothesis is well stated, if the research question is clear, if the methods are well described, the conclusion should stand on their own. Another part of your work as an author to make sure that your paper reads well with reviewers is to be very sure that your literature review is complete, current, up to date. And this is because the reviewer of your paper is very likely to be familiar with your field. They're probably even more familiar with your field than you are. And as a result, they're going to be familiar with the literature in the field and expecting to see it cited properly. And the last thing that I want to say is that short papers, in my experience, are much more likely to succeed than long papers. Short papers are easier to read. It's easier to hold the reader's attention. They're easier to write. It's easier to maintain the continuity of your argument. Long papers that have multiple questions, multiple hypotheses, multiple methods can become very confusing. It can be confusing for the reader, largely because they're confusing for you as the author to write clearly. So if you have a paper that has multiple research questions, if it has multiple methods, if it has multiple hypotheses that are being tested, you should consider breaking that paper into a series of shorter papers rather than trying to communicate everything in one long paper. Okay, so if you're invited to revise your paper and resubmit it to the journal, a revise and resubmit decision is no guarantee of acceptance. Reviewers work for the editor, not for the author. And as the author, you will probably only see part of the reviewer's comments. A substantial share of papers that are revised and resubmitted are eventually rejected. And typically they're rejected because the author failed to address concerns that the reviewer raised. Sometimes papers that reviewers are very positive about, editors nevertheless reject. There can be a lot of reasons for that. Again, most of those are out of your control. So if you get rejected, don't feel bad about it and don't take it personally. You should expect rejection at the start. It happens to everyone. If your gut reaction is to challenge a decision and write a letter back to the editor, telling the editor that the reviewer is an idiot, it's probably not going to help. And it may just end up annoying the editor, which means that the next time you want to send an article to that journal, the editor may remember you and it may be biased against you. The other thing is that often when reviewers recommend rejecting a paper, it's for a good reason. So you should take the comments seriously. Don't immediately send a paper somewhere else to a new journal without revising it. And in my experience, if a reviewer doesn't understand your paper, 9 times out of 10, it's your fault as the author and not the reviewer's fault. There are occasionally reviewers who don't understand papers and it's their fault, but most of the time, reviewers don't understand a paper because an author has failed to communicate clearly. Just remember, if there are multiple referees and an editor and all of them have to like the paper, the chances of getting 3 accept decisions from them, 3 favorable readings, is rather low. So you should always plan for multiple resubmissions. So if you're thinking about your paper in terms of multiple resubmissions, I find it very, very useful to start with what I call a submission tree. So a submission tree is your strategy at the beginning of where you're going to send your paper, which journals you're going to send your paper to, until it gets accepted. And likely the submission tree will be a hierarchical ordering where you'll begin by sending your paper to sort of the best or highest ranked journal where you think it has a chance of getting published. But understanding that rejection is possible, you'll then think about additional journals that you could send your paper to. So again, if you have mentors, try to get advice from your mentors. But for every paper, there should be multiple places to publish it. And you should understand that you probably won't get your paper published the first place you send it. You'll probably have to send it multiple times. And you should be thinking about that at the start. So now I have a second worksheet for you about submission trees. And let me see if I can get that on screen.
Barry, is this the same worksheet as before? Just different
Nope,
questions?
this is a second worksheet. So this should be exercise 2 for submission tree. Can you see that on screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Yep, okay. So just a series of questions for you to think about as you're beginning to decide where to send your paper. So first, what journal do you plan to send your paper to? Why is that? And if that journal rejects your paper, where will you try it next? So think about this in a very strategic way. And in fact, one of the most useful exercises that you might engage in is to look at the reference section of your paper and look at the journals that are cited in your paper. So if you're citing other authors, look at what journals those papers have been published in, and think about submitting your paper to journals on the basis of how frequently you're citing papers from those other journals. And so in general, if you're thinking of sending your paper to a journal that isn't cited in your paper, you should have a very good reason for doing that. Because of this idea that a journal is a place where a conversation is taking place, you want to be engaged in that conversation. You want your paper to be referencing other work that's appeared in that journal. And you want the people who follow you as researchers to be referencing your work. And so the worksheet that I've provided gives you a way of kind of thinking a little bit about strategically which journals you might send your papers to. So let's take a 4-minute break, and you might fill in some of these boxes now, or you might set aside the worksheet and fill in some of those boxes later. All right, so now I want to talk about very specific writing strategies that may be helpful to you. Alex, am I right? We have just over an hour left.
We have about 45 minutes.
We're supposed to end at 12:30. Okay, all right, so that's fine. Let's talk about writing strategies, and just a couple of my favorite quotes about writing from very famous authors. Of course, not all of them academic authors, more literary types, but I think the general principle applies, that typically what is written without effort is read without pleasure, that easy writing makes hard reading, that there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting. That typically we fail to understand how important rewriting and editing is to generating a good paper. Typically, the first draft of a paper should not be the final draft, and you should make sure that you put as much time into writing your paper as you've put into doing the analysis, because typically if the paper is not well written, then reviewers are not going to like it. So the very first thing that I'd like to point out is that analysis is not the same thing as research. So we do research, but analysis is the repackaging of that research into a form that allows others to understand it. And to do that, you have to engage your audience. and you have to tell a convincing story. Most of the time, a paper will succeed if you find a hook, something, something attractive that, like bait that catches a fish, will catch the reader's attention. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about finding a hook for your paper. The paper must be clear, the writing has to be clear, the story has to be clear, especially the contribution to the literature. So it's very, very common for reviewers to point out that they don't see what the contribution of the paper is. And so as a writer, as an author, it's very important for you to tell the reader directly what the contribution of your paper is. There should be a sentence somewhere in the paper, ideally in the introduction, that tells the reader what your contribution to the literature is. Your paper should not be a mystery. We like to read mysteries, but not as academics. So don't make your reader try to figure out what your hypothesis is or what your research question is. State it very clearly. Say, in this paper, we answer the following question. This paper tests the following hypothesis, right? And importantly, I think in most cases, maybe not all, maybe there are some journals where describing what you've done and presenting what the results are is sufficient. But in most cases, readers are looking for an explanation, not just the what did you find, but sort of why is this finding of interest. So, strategies. First of all, read and try to mimic good writing. So if you encounter papers that are attractive to you as a reader, try to mimic the style of the writing. I'm not suggesting that you plagiarize the author, but you can learn a lot by mimicking the structure, the flow, the ways in which ideas are put together in other papers. Each of us works within a specific subdiscipline, and you have to follow the accepted norms and patterns in your subdiscipline. It's sometimes tempting to try to be different or to try to be cute, to try to choose a title that is a little bit cute. I think that it's generally dangerous to do that. I think that especially for those starting out in their career, if the joke doesn't go over well, or if it's not understood, it can be to your disadvantage. You should try to write directly and with confidence, but don't be arrogant. Don't write things like so-and-so wrote a paper in 2015, but was wrong, right? Because it may be that the individual that you're accusing of being wrong is the person who's reviewing your paper. Don't be arrogant. Point out where you are making contributions, not where others have made mistakes. As I said before, make sure that the literature review is very complete and very up to date, because chances are someone in that literature review is going to be a reviewer for your paper. And make sure that your story is clear. You can't assume that everyone reading your paper will understand what your contribution is. And so it's your responsibility to clearly communicate what your contribution is and why it's important. As I said before, and I want to emphasize again, I think that in most cases, you should aim for a short paper versus a long paper. Short papers are easier to write. It's easier to hold the reader's attention. Editors usually prefer shorter papers. And importantly, the room for confusion is much, much reduced in a short paper. So again, if you have multiple research questions, if you have multiple hypotheses, if you have multiple methods that you're using in your paper, consider breaking one paper into several smaller papers. Pay attention to cosmetic issues. The content of the paper matters the most. The thing that we spend most of our time and energy on is getting the analysis right and making sure that the content of the paper is correct. But it turns out that how a paper looks can be very important because first impressions matter. We know that people can have biases, and oftentimes if a paper is sloppily put together, it can communicate sloppiness in the research. You should try to have a clean and consistent look. Don't use multiple fonts. Try to use consistent fonts. Try to make sure that figures are labeled correctly and clearly. Make sure that tables are understandable. Provide plenty of white space on the page for the reviewer who might want to print the paper and write notes in the margins. Just make sure that the paper has a very clean, consistent, and clear look. Okay, so I mentioned previously the importance of finding a hook for your paper. What do I mean by hook? So again, just as you put bait on a hook to try to catch a fish, you want to have a hook with which to catch your reader. And there are three ways that you can create a hook for your paper. One is to ask an interesting question. So the hook may be that you're asking a question that no one else has asked before, or you may be asking a question that has been asked before, but hasn't been answered definitively, or maybe it's been asked for some locations or some populations, but not for others. So the first kind of hook that you should aim for is to ask an interesting research question and to be very crystal clear about the hypothesis that you're testing or the question that's under investigation. If you ask an interesting question, then a reader, a referee, will be inclined to want to read the paper to find out what the answer to the question is. A second hook is to solve a puzzle. So if there's a gap in the literature, so if something has been studied for one population but not another, it may be that you're connecting to previous contributions to the literature and you're solving a problem, an intellectual problem that hasn't been solved previously. And the third way to have a hook in your paper is to have an unexpected finding. So you may have gone looking for one thing and you found another. That may lead you to an explanation for what you found, or it may be a call for more research. In each case, it's perfectly reasonable in the introduction to your paper to be explicit about what your hook is. So in the introduction, you can say, in this paper, we ask the following question. The question has been asked previously by Smith and by Jones for populations in South Asia and in Africa, but never in Latin America. Right? Or in your introduction, you can say, previous literature has pointed to the following, but there's a gap in our understanding about how this applies to the following population. And in this paper, we solve this particular puzzle. Or in the introduction, you can say that we went looking for A and we found B, and that's unexpected. Here's our explanation, and here's our call for more research. So in all cases, what you're trying to do early on in your paper is make it attractive to a reader and attractive to a referee, and to encourage someone to read further in the paper. So now let's do a little bit longer exercise. I'm going to ask each of you to spend some time with the third exercise sheet, or the third page of the exercise sheet, identifying what you think the hook for your paper might be. And so let me stop sharing that and start sharing this page. You might write down the title of your paper, what it's about, what question it answers, whether the data and methods are noteworthy, what the main findings are. But importantly, question 4, what is the hook that will interest readers and reviewers? And so I'm going to let you work on this, let's say for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and at 5 minutes past the hour, I'd like to hear from some of you about your research questions and the hook that you think will interest your readers and reviewers. And so I want to spend a little bit of time. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to talk about titles and abstracts. So in my experience as an editor, I found titles to be extremely important because titles communicate very, very quickly to the editor and to the reviewers what the paper is about. And so I think it's worth spending a lot of time thinking about what your title should be, and to make sure that the title communicates clearly and doesn't have any errors in it. It's amazing to me that I often received papers that had titles that had errors in the title. Sometimes, maybe not always, but sometimes an editor might make a decision about whether to send a paper to reviewers or whether to desk reject a paper simply on the basis of the title. That might seem very arbitrary, but it's also very efficient, and it could be helpful to you as an author, especially if you're sending your paper to a journal where the editor thinks it's not a good fit. And so if your title communicates clearly about what your paper is doing, then it's an efficient way of communicating with the editor about whether the paper is a good fit for the journal. So I have one final worksheet, exercise 4, and it focuses on the title. And so I'd like to give you about 5 minutes to look at the worksheet. Thinking about whether the hook for your paper is included in the title, whether the title is general or specific, and really just putting a lot of thought into the title of your paper, which I think for many of us sometimes is an afterthought. But again, if you think about the way that the review process works, it may be that the title of your paper in some ways is the most important thing, because it's the very first signal that an editor will receive about your paper. So just take a couple of minutes, and if you're working on the worksheets now, fill in some of the boxes. If you're going to work on it later, that's fine too. Okay, I'm curious about your titles. The thing that I would encourage you to do is to make sure that your titles communicate clearly what the paper is about, possibly even including, what the important or interesting research question is. Make sure that the title is specific enough that readers can understand what the paper is about, but not so specific that it communicates too much information. Okay. Finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is abstracts. And the reason for this is because in most cases, if your paper lands on the desk or in the inbox of an editor, and the editor looks at the title and thinks that the title is appropriate for the journal, then the editor will go ahead and read the abstract. And often the decision about whether to send a paper to a reviewer, and if so, to what reviewer or to which reviewer the paper might go, is based on the abstract, right? And so a good abstract increases not only your chances of success in getting into the review process, but a good abstract also means that you'll have a better chance of getting the paper to appropriate reviewers who can make good comments about your paper. So what makes a good abstract? In my experience, an abstract has to answer the following questions. First of all, what the research problem is, what the hypothesis is or the question, what the hook of the paper is, why it is important, how you studied it, in other words, what data and methods are used in the paper, and ideally what you found, so the main conclusion of the paper. For a good abstract, all of that can be done in a couple of hundred words. And really, it is amazing and unfortunate that a lot of abstracts don't answer those questions and therefore don't communicate clearly what the paper is about. So if an abstract doesn't communicate what a paper is about, then the editor is going to be much less likely to send the paper to reviewers, and it's much less likely to send it to reviewers who are going to understand the paper. All right. Beyond the abstract, there's the introduction. The introduction is probably the most important section of the paper. We spend a lot of time on methods, but often the introduction is the most important section of the paper. It has to be very well written. It has to be to the point. And I think it's reasonable to expect that you're going to write and rewrite your introduction multiple times. Many papers get sent back to authors with a reject letter saying that the question didn't seem that important, or the question wasn't clearly expressed or defined. It's really important that in your introduction, you're able to identify what the research question is, why it's important, and how you study it. It's very important to say what the gap in the literature is that the research fills. And in some cases, the introduction should also include some initial findings and why those findings are important, right? So not that different from the abstract. And in fact, if you've written a good introduction, it's very easy to write the abstract because most of the information that you need in the abstract is found in the introduction. There shouldn't be anything mysterious about the paper. When you're writing the introduction, you should make it clear what the paper is about. So some particular strategies for writing the introduction. One is to lead with a question. So in other words, you could make the very first sentence of the introduction, the very first sentence of the paper, a question. In other words, a sentence that ends with a question mark. And so the introduction would begin by saying, why is it that X is associated with Y? This paper answers that question in the context of population living in the following place, right? So you could lead with the question. You should introduce the main point of the paper early. It's sometimes the case that a paper may have a 5-page introduction, and the main point isn't reached until you get to the end of the 5 pages. That's really problematic. Reviewers may lose interest before they get to the main point, before they even understand what the paper is about. I think in the best papers, the introduction says something about the results. Maybe not everything, maybe not all of the conclusions are listed in the introduction, but the introduction should say something about what you find and why it's important. And then, as I said before, the introduction is so very important that you should plan to rewrite it multiple times. You should try to get other people to read the introduction, and you should think carefully about whether it communicates the main points of the paper clearly. Some things that are problems to avoid. First of all, as I said, don't wait too long to state the question that you are asking in the paper. So in other words, if a reviewer has to read through 3 pages or 4 pages before getting to the main question of the paper, then you may lose the reader's attention. Don't overpromise and then underdeliver. It's very, very common for the introduction to make claims of what the paper will accomplish. And then if you actually look at the conclusions of the paper, or if you look at what is actually done in the results section, a lot of the things that are promised in the introduction are never delivered in the findings of the paper. And then finally, I hope that I've said this enough that you understand that it's important. Don't make it difficult to understand what the contribution of the paper is. State it very clearly. You can have a sentence in the introduction that says, the main contribution of this paper is the following, right? It's okay to be that direct and that clear. That's far better than making it a mystery. The middle of the paper is one that you'll spend a lot of time on, the methods and the results. But as I said before, the probably most important parts of the paper from the perspective of reviewing and getting the paper into the hands of reviewers is the introduction. It's also equally important to pay attention to what you're writing in the conclusion. Often the conclusion is kind of an afterthought, but many readers, especially referees, reviewers who are reading your paper, will try to line up the introduction with the conclusions and make sure that what you're promising in the introduction is what you're actually delivering in the conclusions. The conclusions are a good place to repeat the research question, to remind the reviewer of the methods that you used and what you found. It's a good place to remind the reviewer of any key assumptions, especially assumptions that may be important to the results. I think it's very important to put the results in context, especially in a policy context, to say why the results are important, not just what the results are. I think it's very important to only conclude things that are based on the results of the paper. So for many of us, it can be very tempting in the conclusions to begin to speculate or to offer opinions about what should be done that go far beyond what you've discovered and what you've reported in the results. It may be that you have very strong feelings about what policy should be, but unless the results of the paper inform those policies, you should refrain from making bold claims about what policymakers should be doing. The conclusion is not the place to introduce new topics. Typically, you shouldn't be citing new sources or introducing new questions. You can call for new analysis, especially analysis that might extend or confirm your findings in other samples or in other settings. And it's often the case that in the conclusion, you might acknowledge any weaknesses or flaws in the paper. Okay, so just a couple of final concerns. One, always acknowledge the sponsor and anyone who assisted in the paper, especially acknowledging them by name. You should only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Your paper should not be under consideration in multiple journals. And it could even lead to problems if the same reviewer is picked by multiple journals and finds that you've submitted your paper to multiple journals simultaneously. Be very, very careful about plagiarizing. Always make sure that you're citing key work by other individuals. And don't reproduce figures or tables from other sources unless you have the permission to do that. Right. I'd just like to end with a couple of emerging issues that have been on my mind and maybe on yours. First, many journals are moving towards an open access platform. If you have the opportunity to publish your paper open access, you should do so. If your paper is being sponsored, the research is being paid for by an international foundation or by an international organization, they may actually have requirements that you publish your paper in an open access format. And it's certainly a way to make your publication, your research more widely available. So if you have the opportunity to publish open access, try to do that. As I mentioned previously, avoid predatory journals, especially journals that invite you to publish, but require you to pay in order to publish. Typically, those journals are not indexed, they're not reputable, and if you're early in your career, they may actually harm your reputation and create challenges for you later in your career. So avoid those kinds of journals whenever you can, and talk to other colleagues about journals that you may have questions about. Some journals are moving toward models in which the data used in the analysis, or in some cases, the computer code necessary to replicate the findings, have to be published or made available. I generally think this is a good thing because it makes our research more defensible if it can be replicated and if the data are made available for others. Sometimes there are confidentiality issues that may prevent you from making your data open. And generally those kinds of details can be worked out with the journal. And then finally, an issue that probably wasn't on any of our radar screens a year ago is the use of AI and ChatGPT as a co-author. There was recently an interesting story in the journal Nature about some journals that are receiving articles that have listed ChatGPT as a co-author. I think that that's generally being frowned upon, and I think that for the time being, relying on ChatGPT as a co-author is probably not a good strategy. Okay, so that's it. I will make all of my slides available to you. I'll send them to Alex, and I think Alex can share them all with you by email. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'll try to answer any questions that may be remaining.
We had a question in the chat from Metal Tisso.
Yeah.
Can you use AI tools to rephrase or proofread your work?
So, you know, I think that we're in a period of transition. I think that people are finding ways to use AI tools to help improve their work. I think that it's probably acceptable up to the point where you're using AI to actually write the paper and package the findings. So I think you have to proceed with caution. I think that I have to admit that I'm not, completely well versed in the use of AI tools, and these are all very new and they're evolving very quickly. I think that some uses of AI are probably acceptable and more benign than others.
I think we had another question about submitting abstracts to a conference from Hawa.
Yeah, I think I answered that in the chat.
Okay, great.
We tried to. And my general perspective is that if a paper is unpublished or in review, it's okay to present it at a conference. Once a paper is published, then it's generally considered bad form to present it at a conference, unless you're presenting something that's new or an extension of what has already been published. But different conferences and different journals have different policies on that. You should probably check with conference organizers first. Well, thanks everybody for joining me today. I hope some of what I said was useful. And I would encourage you all to not get discouraged, but to keep working hard on your papers. And I wish you all the luck and best of luck in publishing.